Hello, guys. Welcome to week 5 of Intro to Geography. And this week we're going to be picking up with human interaction, or spatial interaction, as it might better be known. And we're going to be discussing how things are related over space. How do things interact? What are the interdependencies that exist between places and populations? And most importantly, we're going to be getting into the notion of movement, whether that's the movement of people via migration or the movement of goods, the movement of services, the movement of animals, even to some extent, if we're looking at that, or even how wind patterns that we just got done, how do those things move through? Those are also spatial interactions. More specifically, this week, we're going to really start transitioning away from that physical environment piece into more of the human environment aspect, and viewing it everything now from the aspect of human systems and human impact on the world and on other human systems. So how do humans deal with the environment is one of the things that we'll catch on to in a couple weeks. But also then what are we going to be looking at? Human movement toward extracting and processing and transporting energy resources and other natural resources, and then economic goods, and then how do those things build up and relate to political systems and demographic movements and a whole host of different things that all are going to have some measure of spatial interaction. So this really sets the stage for discussing how the processes actually manifest themselves as we're analyzing and taking a look at these different human phenomena and the interactions with various natural phenomena. How do those all interact with each other? And this is a very complex, it's one of the most rich avenues of research within the field, various fields of geography. It's where a lot of the interesting work is being done, which is just how are things actually happening? It's kind of like the big question is what's going on, and in some ways, what we're interested in is what's going on in different places around the world. How are things related to each other, and how are those things moving through space? That's the basics of what we're looking at. So we'll get into the slides here and get everything moving through. Here we have our initial slide, which is kind of an interesting sort of little picture here, right? There is some sort of aspects of human interaction that are going on here, and we have a human system, obviously neighborhood, environment here, and then we can see that we have some additional systems that are maybe coming into play as well. When we're looking at that, we have roadway network that's going on. We have a variety of different people who are existing in sort of a community with houses, and so we have a neighborhood. So there's some sort of structured urban form that's manifesting itself. We see the little pond and waterways, which there means there's a water control system that's available in there in some way, and it's also some sort of modification of the environment that's creating some type of potential interactions that are going on, and also undergirding all of these homes and these obvious transportation systems. There's also running along in there the various communication systems that are in there, the power grid, all those different sorts of underlying infrastructure that enable these interactions to go ahead and take place. And so this just kind of gives you a little brief snapshot of how we can actually start pulling out from just one little scene here a variety of different human interactions and how those interactions are going to exist over space. And that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about for the rest of the chapter, where we're going to be getting into what is human interaction or spatial interaction, and then the effect of distance and other barriers to interaction, right? How do things in the physical environment or other human systems impact human interaction, economic interaction, migration, all those different things that might come into play? What are the things that impact that, or maybe even facilitate that type of movement? We'll then get into probably another video getting into human interaction and innovation. That gets into the individual activity space to some extent, which is oftentimes going to be conditioned, say, by access to transportation or what types of transportation are available to a person. We'll then get into diffusion systems or diffusion processes. That's also going to have an aspect of medical geography that's this chapter is going to start talking about, where we're getting into issues of disease spread and issues with that. That also gets into the processes of technology diffusion and idea diffusion. Many of the same processes that are allowing for the transmission of disease are also things that allow for the transmission of ideas and technologies as well. So they're the same means or processes come into play. We'll then kind of wrap it up by taking a look at migration. That's kind of your weekly discussion. I'm going to be focusing a little bit on migration, which is the movement of peoples from one place to another, either on a temporary or seasonal or permanent basis, as the case might be. And that feeds directly then into the last little bit, which is globalization and integration. And this is going to be kind of an economic aspect, but it's also got some political overtones to it. And also how that has an impact on, again, things like migration, but also the economic movement of goods and services through space. So that's going to basically give us the upshot of what we're going to focus on this week. And so the next little bit, I'll get into these the distance barriers to interaction, what's going on. We'll wrap it up with a couple more videos dealing with some of the other items that are on here. So what is it? What is human interaction, or what is spatial interaction? As I mentioned, there says communication and interdependencies between people. Well, okay, what does that mean? Oh, what it basically means is when you communicate with somebody, you are interacting with that person. Now, if that communication is verbal, if it's face-to-face, we could map that. It is a spatial interaction. It's just that the space and the distance separating the two people might be very, very small. By the same token, if you were on the phone, you could be talking with somebody on the other side of the world. That's also a potentially mappable interaction. If I have your phone location and that person's phone location, we can sit there and say that there's some level of communication that's existing between these spatially separated people. And then we deal with some other different things that go on between that. And we can then measure, hopefully, what's the level of interdependence, right? Or what's the level or intensity of interaction that's existing over space as we start talking about these relationships between people, between economic entities, how goods and services are moving, and things like that. And that leads directly into this notion of movement. And when we are looking at movement, we're looking at the movement of people, goods, information, disease, ideas, languages, fashion. It's a whole host of different things that might come about that are, culturally enriched or culturally in communication, movement of music, of food, of ways of doing things. All of these things actually are all part of the analysis of movement between different places. So it's not just physical things necessarily, but there's a lot that we can cram into that information aspect. But a lot of it is going to be the movement of economic goods and services across the globe. And one of the main takeaways that we're going to have in here is that the amount of interaction is going to be a function of both the size of the population and the distances that exist between them. And what does that mean? It means that if you have a lot of people who are living in a relatively confined space, say a city, they are going to interact with each other more than they are if they are spatially separated. Moreover, people who are closer to each other are going to interact with each other more than they are going to interact with people who are, further away. And that is a function of distance and cost and other barriers to interaction that we'll get to in just a second, and kind of just fill in what does that mean, that it's a function of the size of the population and the distance that exists between them. What it basically means is, is the upshot. It's the closer you are to something, the more you are potentially likely to interact with that something rather than interacting with something that is a long ways away. So the closer you are to something and the more somethings you're close to, the greater the amount of interaction, whether that something is people, goods, information, disease, whatever the case might be. The further away you are from something, the less likely you are to interact with it. That's essentially what we're talking about. That's the fundamental regarding that function. And as I mentioned, distance is the key for most of the levels of interaction that are going to occur. The greater the human interaction is going to be, it's going to probably be happening over shorter distances rather than longer distances. So, for example, on a daily basis, most of us are probably not getting on a plane and flying to New York City or London and then back again. And that's, over the course of our day, right? That we're going ahead and doing that. To the extent that we do, we probably make one trip to London maybe, or one trip to New York City, and then maybe one back to Knoxville. By the same token, we probably don't necessarily even have great interaction with Nashville or Chattanooga or Atlanta or Asheville. But we're going to probably have a greater amount of interaction with those locations, with Nashville or Atlanta, than we are with New York and London. Why? Because New York and London are further away. We're going to have more interaction in, say, Knoxville with Oak Ridge or Maryville or Sevierville, and then within Knoxville than we are even with, say, Nashville or Chattanooga or Atlanta or Asheville. Why? Because the distances between those distances that separate those locations are smaller. Thus, the smaller the distance between humans or particular locations, the more activity that's going to be able to occur. Just because there are 24 hours in the day and distance does take time to overcome, right? It's not Star Trek. We can't just, beam people from one place to another or goods and services from one place to another relatively instantly. It still takes time to actually move through space. And because it does take time to move through space, the longer the distance, the longer the time. Or the greater the commitment of time to go ahead and overcome that distance. And that's that time, distance, and friction of distance concept that we're dealing with. One other aspect or related aspect to this is this notion of psychological distance. And you guys have experienced this more often than not, especially if you drive, okay? So the psychological distance, or the notion of psychological distance, has sort of two components. They're related, though, in intimately in a way, because it's dealing with how your brain is processing spatial information. The first instance would be when you drive someplace you have not been before. Okay, so let's just say that drive is going to be 20 miles long. It may seem that it takes a lot longer to drive that 20 miles because you're not familiar with it than it does when you're taking that same distance back. Okay, now, given that there might be variations in traffic light length or when you're hitting the green lights on that 20-mile trip, other than that, everything else is going to be equal. The distance and the time is going to be relatively the same. But psychologically, when you're going into that new area, your brain is picking out landmarks. It's trying to determine where you are. It's going to try and drop essentially breadcrumbs so that you can find your way back, right? So that you don't get lost. That working of your brain to do that creates a psychological impression of a longer amount of time. Your brain is having to work harder to find out where you are and where you are going. Once you are on your way back, you're essentially picking up those breadcrumbs and the territory is becoming more and more familiar. You're able to pick out landmarks. And so the psychological aspect of it is that you are getting closer and closer and closer to home, and so it's becoming more and more familiar, and your brain can sort of not have to worry about trying to identify all the landmarks. And so psychologically that distance shrinks, right? The time that it takes to travel that distance, even though it's the same, even though the time itself is actually probably the same or very close to it, it just seems like it takes less time, and it's much quicker to get back home, essentially, from where you were driving to that unfamiliar place. By the same token, which we kind of see on this slide, you've got that frictionless zone. That's kind of the area within psychological distance right here, this frictionless zone, that you essentially can almost consider it sort of the human version of autopilot. This is the zone in which you do a lot of your activities, but a lot of times when you're driving through this, you're not really paying attention too much to your movement through that space, such that you might be able to, you kind of know how you've gotten around but you don't really necessarily think about it too much, and you would be hard pressed to actually maybe even remember your drive home, about particular aspects of it, unless there's something particularly noticeable that you are going to key in on. That is what is another aspect of psychological distance that also begins to identify what we call the home area. It's also going to be intimately associated with that individual activity space that we'll probably get to on the next video. But this gets into what are those barriers to interaction, or how do we actually see those play about. We've got this frictionless zone that's in there, which is going to be some area kind of usually around where you live, but it's going to be conditioned by your activity space, right? So where are you moving through on any given day that you kind of have as part of your routine. But at some point, there's going to be some sort of critical distance, and that critical distance is going to be different for each person, just because of our own individual needs and stations in life at any given time. But at some point, you are going to have less and less interaction. There's going to be some distance beyond which you are not going to have a frequent amount of interaction, beyond which, say, that autopilot does not kick in, and you're back into that notion of making more conscious decisions of how you're actually moving through space. And as that distance increases, your ability to interact with those areas that are further away becomes constrained by the temporal factor of having to traverse that distance, that it's going to take more time to do so. And because of the limitations of time, you're not going to be able to drive out a long distance, say, or travel a long distance without it impacting your ability to do other things. And so your interactions beyond that particular point, that critical distance threshold, are going to be minimized going forward. And that's a function of distance, but it's also just the cost of time and the cost of transportation, etc., to move out a particular distance. This is another way of kind of taking a look at that as well, and sort of the friction of distance. This is a logarithmic graph. It's kind of an interesting way of taking a look at things. This is dealing with, on the left side here, this is the percentage of the population. So we're starting off with like 0.1% of the population and then working our way up to 100%. And everything that's on here is going to add up. All these little dots here are effectively going to add up to 100% of the population. So what this is giving us is an idea that after Katrina, there was some displacement of persons potentially from their homes. And so the question is, where did they go? And the bottom, along the bottom axis here, what we're looking at is the distance. So where did they go? What were the distances that they moved through after Katrina came in? And we can see that most of the people, roughly about 55% of the population of New Orleans, stayed in the New Orleans area. An additional 35% or so basically stayed within the rest of Louisiana. They were going to Baton Rouge and Lake Charles and Shreveport and some of the other areas that are around in there. So between 55 and 35, we got 90% of the population stayed very, very close, within about 100 miles of New Orleans. But we can see here there was about maybe 5 to 6, 7% of the population that went and stayed in kind of we'll call it sort of the next ring out of major metropolitan areas, or at least metropolitan areas. So they would go to like Jackson, Mississippi, and then Houston, Texas. And then a few more, that would come in. They would go to San Antonio, Dallas, Little Rock. So in the 300 to maybe 500 mile range was where another big chunk. And at that point, we've got almost about 98, 99% of the population is staying within 300 to 500 miles. But you can see that there's this huge drop off in the amount of people that we're dealing with as that distance increases. And eventually we get out to people that are down into Charlotte and all the way out to Los Angeles. But we're talking about smaller and smaller and smaller increments of population moving further and further away. And generally what we can say is there's a couple different things. Most people are going to stay as close to home. Their expectation is that they are going to go back. Some of the other people who might have been more displaced or had maybe major damage to their homes or businesses, they're now moving into areas that are going to be nearby, so it's going to minimize their cost from that standpoint. But they're also going to have, between San Antonio, Dallas, Atlanta, Houston, they're going to have better, say, employment prospects. And so they might actually be using this as a point to transition and leave New Orleans and move into these other areas. Or there's a better chance for them to be able to sort of sustain a transition out of New Orleans after the hurricane. And then we have the Charlotte on down to Los Angeles type population. And generally our explanation for that is going to be that those are going to happen because they have relatives there, right? So they're moving to where they have a family connection. And so that migration is going to be more conditioned by family relationships than economic relationships or any particular desirability to go to those places in and of themselves. So the further distance away, there's some other attractor to those that's going to probably be a family relationship. So what are some of the other barriers to interaction that exist out there? Well, there's the physical environment itself, okay? Mountains, deserts, oceans, rivers, other things that might come into play as well. Is it a primarily cold, snowy environment, right? Or, is it a large plain that doesn't have a whole lot of roadways? There's a whole host of different physical environmental factors that might come into play. Mountains being a good one. There aren't potentially very many passes through the mountains, so traffic is constrained to go through only a handful of different places to get from east to west or north to south or from one side to the other. Deserts, obviously, the lack of access to fresh water, potentially harsh conditions can serve as a deterrent to people moving through those spaces, particularly if they don't have a means of transportation that makes it easier for them to get across those deserts. So if they're looking at moving on foot, a desert can be a fairly substantial barrier. Oceans, by the same token, just because of the distances involved and the lack of freshwater resources and things like that, oceans can be a barrier. Rivers can be kind of an interesting thing because they can be a barrier, but they can also be a facilitator of interaction. So if you are dealing with a river, there might be some constraints because there might only be a few places where you can ford that river or have an easy portage or have a bridge over that river to get from one side to the other. But if you do have a boat, a canoe, whatever the case might be, barge, movement up and down that river is actually a facilitator of interaction because you can move up and down that river on those different conveyances. So rivers can actually act as a facilitator of interaction, although they can also act as a barrier. Other types of barriers that come about are cultural. So these are sort of human imposed barriers to interaction that might occur. One of the big ones might be religion. So if, for example, you don't see huge movements of Christian populations into Muslim-dominated territories or Muslims moving into Christian-dominated territories and all sorts of other things. So religion can act as a major barrier. Associated with that, oftentimes, is going to be linguistic barriers, right? Sometimes those can easily be overcome if there are other factors that work through it. But you don't see a whole lot of Americans who are primarily English speakers and don't have generally a great interest in foreign language development, because of the size of our economy and our position globally. We don't really need to learn additional languages. We see that, there aren't a whole lot of people who are going to be going over and moving to China or moving to Japan or Germany or France or some other non-English speaking country that they would otherwise potentially consider for economic opportunity. By the same token, because English is a globalized language and it is so dominant, particularly because of the Great Britain, Canada, the United States, Australia, etc., from a global economic standpoint, English is a very attractive language to learn. So people learn English a lot, and so they are much more willing to move into English-speaking countries as a result. A couple other factors that come into play: ideology, gender, and really read here sex. Okay, not really gender. It's not a gender identity issue. It's sex that they're talking about here. Ideology and political system are going to be generally fairly related, but ideology also carries with it some sort of the notion of like an ethnocentric sort of aspect to it that might give you a notion that you have a greater sense of place and place identity, and so who you are might be very much tied up into your ancient where your ethnic heritage is from, such that you are not willing to give that up. That acts as a barrier to you moving or migrating away from that area, and it could also potentially throw up barriers to you purchasing things or consuming things that are coming from outside your system. The political system itself, it can be existing barriers. These are going to be migration barriers, population migration controls, and things like this that are generally dealing with issues of immigration and border control. So we have, our various efforts on our southern border, primarily to control immigration and people coming in. That's going to be sort of one of the things that's going to be in your weekly discussion, looking at that. By the same token, we've had political systems in the not so distant past that were interested in keeping people in, right? They did not want people to live. We still see this in North Korea today, right? So they have walls and fences that are designed not to keep people out, but they are designed to keep people in. So we saw this in Eastern Europe after the fall of World War II, and essentially got put in place by about 1960 or so. We set a system of walls, barriers, fences that were expressly designed to keep people in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and to keep them from being able to interact and moving into the West. And so it was by controlling movement of people outside the political system, the communist political system, and there was also severe controls on movement of people even within those systems. And that did create substantial barriers to interaction for a large portion of the population of the old Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations that were associated with it. Again, psychological barriers to interaction. This can be sort of used in crowded areas. This can be sort of your, how do you navigate through crowds? How do you deal with people in crowded environments? And to what extent do you go out of your way to, say, maybe avoid a crowded place? And so how do you actually deal with those privacy issues? And that is also oftentimes a culturally determined thing. Here in the United States, we have much more expansive ideas of personal space that are not really in play in India or China, where you've got a few billion people all in areas that are smaller than the United States. So 3 times the number of people in territories that are smaller than the United States. So that gets us into, how do you actually deal with those crowds or not deal with those crowds, as the case might be when you're dealing with that stuff. And we'll leave it there for the first video, and I'll come back in and pick it up with some additional stuff coming on here, dealing with human interaction, innovation diffusion, and some of the other issues dealing with more specifically human invention.